So let's zoom in now on what it is that the Abacus is designed to do and how it allows us to do many of the things that we want an assessment framework to do. The first thing to say is that some of this is done for us, but the bits that aren't done for us are the bits that we now have to do. And it's crucial to bear in mind, I think, that this was designed for education. It was built originally around the needs of schools in the UK preparing themselves for an Ofsted inspection. What it does is then work through all the ways in which a service, quite a complex service or school, can prepare itself for the kind of assessment that is going to come from outside, an external assessment. And because it's an external assessment, because it's a government-run thing, some of the key framework is already given in advance. The Department of Education had decided what it saw as being the key areas to look at in judging a school's performance, and it had already decided what are the gradations of attainment of progress, from bad or failing, as they put it, through to good, middling, making progress, needing attention, and finally outstanding or exemplary, as I would have it. What we're after, I think, is a language which is less about that sort of shock and awe blaming, less judgmental than the Department of Education was after, and something which is much more encouraging services at the beginning of this process to look at what they can do next. And in fact, right through, one of the real strengths of the Abacus model and the Abacus software is that it allows you at any level to ask yourself, so what do we do next? And to choose from potentially quite a wide menu of issues that you've identified as the next step, the next priority for your particular service or your organisation or your area. So let's have a look at this in more detail. So let's look first at the basic process of the Abacus assessment, and at its simplest it boils down to 4 questions which you approach in a particularly helpful way. The first question is, how well are we performing now? Whatever performing well might mean in the context of your particular service, where in your judgment are you as an individual and as a team, as a service? Are you at the beginnings of developing towards, granted this is a PIEs assessment, are you at the beginnings of developing as a PIE? Are you some way underway? Do you feel you're making progress? And you can look at each of those areas in turn and make a separate judgment about each of those areas. Then, why do you say that? What's your evidence? How would you explain to somebody else that that's why you think that this is where you're at, where you've reached? What is the relatively objective evidence that you could quote to justify the judgment that you've made? And the next question, the point at which it gets really interesting, what in that case will help you move forward? And what holds you back? And at this point, the Abacus process is moving beyond being simply an assessment, a statement of where you're at, to something which is about process change management, improvement. But it's all based on your own assessment and your own priorities and your own strengths and weaknesses in your own context. This is something that you have to do by discussion and dialogue within your own team, within your own service. Based on what's happening, what holds you back and what can take you forward, the next question is, well then, what are you going to do? What's your action plan? What are the things that are most important to you next? What are your priorities? What's most important but hardest to do? What's relatively easy to do, although it may not be the most important thing, but it's going to get you moving, and why not do that now then? So on a number of areas, each of those areas that you've picked out where you had evidence for what your judgment was, you looked at what your strengths and weaknesses are in those areas. In each of those areas you can then go back and say, so what are we going to do now here about this? In fact, for our purposes, we've actually added a final question, or a final stage, which is peer review, but we'll come back to that in a second. Let's first see how that whole process operates as a cycle. Again, in the Abacus, people have come up with this rather nice, simple little design. It begins, of course, with that same how do you form a judgment. They suggest then checking your judgment against the criteria. In the course of schools, of course, there are the Ofsted criteria spelt out. In the case of PIEs, we have no such external body determining what is proper, and here we've had to look quite carefully at the wording of the PIEs formula to make sure that it is capturing all the issues that we now have. And we've spent quite a lot of time over the past year trying to get a formulation of the basic essence of a PIE that is as flexible as possible and responds to as many of the kind of circumstances that we come across as possible. So the process begins with you forming a judgment on where you feel your service has reached in terms of developing as a PIE, using whichever particular aspects of the PIE formula customised for your circumstance seem most appropriate to you. Then, again, you justify it with evidence. You come up with your examples of what it is that you do or what it is that you think you're not doing yet, so that you're not further down the line. You analyse in terms of what helps and hinders your progress. This is a SWOT analysis for those who are familiar with strengths, weaknesses, opportunities and threats. And then based on that analysis, in each of those areas where you've identified where you think you're at, and you could be very, very advanced in one area, less so in another. And on that basis you form your action plan, and then depending on whether what you're intending to do is relatively quick to do, in which case you could evaluate fairly quickly what it may be, but if it's going to involve quite a lot of work, maybe you want to adapt the building or even move to a different building or completely renegotiate your arrangements with other services or commissioners, that's going to take longer. So you set your evaluation point at wherever it needs to be depending on the nature of the change. All of this is totally customised to your needs and your circumstances. So it's a generalisable process, but it's very, very specific and led by frontline action learning and practice development, hopefully informed by reflective practice and any other issues. And then finally, the last thing to notice is in the centre of that cycle, as the Abacus format proposes, collaborate and disseminate. Now, what they had in mind primarily was collaborating and disseminating between different teams within a school. In the Abacus process, as we are construing it and as we want to try and pilot it, there is a peer review process rather than external assessment. So for us, collaborate and disseminate will mean finding another service sufficiently comparable to yours, working in your area, whether that means in your geographical area, obviously more convenient for transport, or whether it means in your specialist niche, in which case you might want to use the internet and less frequent visits. But you are going through that same process. How well are we performing? What's our evidence? What are our strengths and weaknesses? And you're discussing that with another team that can come in and look at what you're doing. And that peer review and peer accountability is the key distinction, the key difference between the PIEs approach and the Abacus for schools. One last thing to say then. The Abacus approach was originally developed on pen and paper, flip charts and so on for a group of teachers sitting around a table in a school. And for a small service, a small organisation where you can get everybody round a room, that is the most effective way of making it work. But for a larger organisation, a secondary school is a pretty big organisation, but a housing association that covers possibly the whole of the country, getting everybody round a table is simply not feasible.
And yet if you want everybody involved, let alone service users and other partners, then moving towards using the software at that point becomes incredibly valuable. The software has all the sort of bells and whistles of this built into it. It's the same process, exactly the same process, but it functions online and therefore allows you to form your judgment and share your judgment of where you're at across much larger distances, including having maybe 100 or a couple of hundred workers in a large organisation with multiple sites, all working in the same way. That is probably very, very cost effective for a large organisation, but you don't have to do that. The flip chart and felted pen version is exactly the same and works the same way. So now the thing to do, I think, is to take a few examples of this. So let's look at the Pizazz as it applies to a small organisation which is mainly building based, or a hostel or a refuge or a day centre perhaps. Let's look at how this works in outreach. Let's look at how it works in a more complex, multifaceted service. And then finally let's look at how this works as a whole system and a system change approach at perhaps locality level.